So, good morning, ladies. We're going to be moving on to look at the next section, next narrated PowerPoint on CC14, the international economy, the international economy, and we're going to be starting off on page 33 in your CC14 booklets, and the title is on page 33, Restrictions on Free Trade. So we're going to start to look at protectionism. Now, there are some terms in the at the start of page 33, which gives you some definitions on some of the key terms that you'll need to understand when it comes to discussing protectionism, and we will then move on and take a look at how those things affect free trade. So, in essence, protectionism is something that I think you may have done before, or may be aware of, at the very least. And basically, it's ways in which countries, for various reasons, choose to restrict free trade. Now, there are a number of reasons, and this first introductory slide gives you some as an examples, and we'll look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. But there are a number of legitimate reasons why a country might choose, or an economy might choose, to restrict free trade, and some of those are listed there. So we've got protection of infant sectors, could be employment protection, could be as a response to import dumping, or it could be due to a response to chronic trade gaps or deficits. So again, a number of sensible, I suppose, economic reasons that you could, in some cases, justify restricting free trade. So let's take a look at these in a little bit more detail then. So first and foremost, and what we're going to cover in this section is to do with the types of protectionist policies that are potentially in place, and the reasons, first and foremost, for the restrictions on free trade, and then the different types of restrictions that can be applied, like, for instance, tariffs, quotas. We'll look at subsidies to domestic producers, and we'll also look at non-tariff barriers, okay? And then also we'll try to look at the impact of these protectionist policies on consumers, producers, governments, living standards, and equality. Now, again, if ever you get a question on protectionism or on the principles of restrictions of free trade, again, that's not a bad, that last point there, point C, is not a bad way of thinking about, particularly if it's a long question, 25 marker, then that's a good way of attempting to make sure that you consider all the implications of protectionist policies on the different economic agents and other things too. Okay, so let's take a look at page 33 then. What is it? Okay, so protectionism is basically the use of trade barriers to favour domestic suppliers at the expense of foreign suppliers. That's fundamentally the reason for it, okay? And there are a number of reasons why a government might choose to restrict imports. Try jotting a few of those down, have a think about them, and think about the reasons why a government might choose to restrict imports. Could be a whole raft of reasons, but give yourself some time to do that. And then obviously we can hopefully enhance your understanding as we go through some of these further slides. Okay. So examples, number one, protecting jobs in home or domestic economies. Clearly that can be a very good and legitimate reason for bringing in protectionist policies. We know that in some cases there are obviously some negatives to protectionism, and we'll take a look at some of those as we go as well. But that's certainly a very good reason in the first instance. Another reason could be to improve the balance of payments current account. Remember, that is the difference between exports and imports. And if we're in a situation on the current account where we are importing much too much and not exporting enough, well, we might choose to restrict imports by using trade barriers, in this case, using some forms of protectionism. Let's take a look at some of the key terms that are mentioned in terms of restrictions on free trade. So on page 33, as I mentioned previously, you've got some key definitions that you can just make sure you're familiar with. Some I think you'll probably be reasonably familiar with, but so if any of those you don't understand, then have a read through those and highlight the bits that you need to particularly remember. Okay, so what we're going to do as the next thing then, and this is a diagram that you will need to understand and will need to be able to explain in time, but we're going to take a look at tariffs as the first instance. Okay, the first type of protectionist measure that an economy might choose to use. So basically a tariff is a tax on imports, and the effect of imposing a tariff can be analysed using a diagram that we'll look at shortly, and this is one that you will need to understand and appreciate. Okay, now there are a number of assumptions that underlie any of these models, particularly as far as tariffs are concerned. So we're going to look at the effect of a tariff on wheat. Now in this instance, what we're assuming is that the wheat that's produced in the UK is the same as the wheat produced in the rest of the world, so it's a homogeneous product. Second thing is that the domestic supply curve for wheat is upward sloping, so as the price of wheat in the UK rises, then UK farmers have a greater incentive to grow more wheat, and as a result there will be further supplies as a result of that. The third view is that in this case, obviously the UK market, if we're using the UK market as an example, is a relatively small market, although we do produce a lot of wheat. In the grand scheme of things, the price of imports is determined in the world market and not in the UK market. Now the reasons for that is that if you think about the UK being a relatively small part of the world economy for wheat, well, in that case, the changes in UK supply won't have a huge effect on the supply across the world, and the UK demand isn't going to have a huge impact on world demand for wheat. So one could argue, as a result of that, the UK is not really affected by the world price. Sorry, no, that's not right. Sorry, rephrase that. That the UK market will not affect the world price. Okay, so because we're a relatively small producer, that essentially means that the supply of imports is perfectly elastic in the UK market. So you could argue this is almost like a perfectly competitive scenario, isn't it? Not absolutely, but there are some assumptions within that which sort of demonstrate the same sort of principle. So let's take a look at what that means then. So if we take a look at the world wheat market, okay, there we have the world wheat market. Okay, so you can see we've got supply and demand, and we've got a price that's elastic, based on the assumption that we made previously, perfectly elastic. So effectively, there we have a market price effectively created by the world market, and that market price is P at quantity of QE. Okay, so that's where supply and demand in the world market meets, where we're at equilibrium, and the price is then determined at P. If we then take a look at the UK wheat market then, okay, now clearly in this instance we've got a slightly different scenario going on, haven't we? Okay, so we've got the world market price, okay, so the world price and the supply level in world markets. Okay, now in this instance we can see that our supply in domestic terms is significantly different, and our equilibrium point is also significantly different. Okay, now you can imagine, given that we don't really have any influence over world price, that we're not going to have any impact on this at all, but it will have an impact on us when we come to look at imports and exports. And so as a result of that, you can see in this case, so this is the world market without a tariff. Okay, now one could argue that if we're clearly we are not in a competitive scenario here with the world world price and the world supply. So in this situation, we would maybe look to try to influence the level of imports and exports by introducing, in this case, a world price plus the tariff. Okay, so the tariff would be introduced in order that we would hopefully then gain some extra production for our domestic suppliers, and also we would be able to generate that based on this price. And so we've got any product that we are actually being imported is made to be slightly more expensive by the tariff, the tariff charge. So as a result of that, that will affect the market, not significantly, but certainly to a point. Okay. So let's just take a look at in this scenario then. So if we take a look at page 34, okay, where we've got the wheat market with the tariff, which is that one there where we've got the tariff and the deadweight loss being shown. That basically is the way in which we would demonstrate the effect of a tariff on the price, on the world price of wheat in terms of coming into our economy. So if we take a look at the equilibrium price, if no wheat was imported into the UK, in this case that would be PE. So let's just go back a moment and look at, so in this instance that would be PE. If wheat is imported at the price WP, then domestic quantity supplied is Q1, domestic quantity demanded is Q2, and you may need to refer back to that original drawing or that original example on the previous slide in order to make sure that this makes sense. So the level of imports in this instance would be Q1 minus Q2. And if the tariff is imposed on wheat, then our domestic quantity supplied would increase to Q3. Our domestic quantity demanded would change to Q4. And our level of imports would change from Q3 minus Q4. Okay, so there would be a significant change. Now, effectively, what one could argue is that would then mean that, excuse me, domestic producers would be able to produce more, and would take up the slack of suppliers that chose not to do so because of the extra tariff, and also demand may also change too. Okay, so let's take a look then at the next example. Okay, so we've moved on from page 33 to look at the difference between the price prior to tariffs and then the price after tariffs, and how that affects both demand and supply. So let's take a look at the practice question that you've got on halfway down page 34 in your CC14 booklet, and there is a question which is spelt out for you there, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm looking at the same thing as you are. So in this instance then we've got our drawing of a market. Okay, in this instance the market is showing that we've got supply and demand at a certain level, we've got supply at the world price, and then the supply with the tariff added. Okay, so in this instance let's just take a look at how we might arrive at answering these questions. So we've got this example showing domestic supply and demand, or demand and supply, and in this instance it's showing domestic demand and supply for a particular good. So what is the equilibrium price and quantity demanded and supplied domestically? That's the first question we're going to be looking at. Okay, then we're going to look at, so in this instance, what is that? What would that be? So equilibrium price and quantity demanded. supplied domestically would basically be 75 at a price of 50. Okay, so in this instance then, okay, if we look at how these things change somewhat, so in the first instance, if we're just looking at supply and demand in the domestic market, then there's going to be no impact. That wouldn't actually, the change in world price or a tariff wouldn't have any impact if we weren't actually trading internationally. So if we start to trade internationally, the international price of the product is for the product shown is 20. Okay, so international price, world price is 20, and you can see that's where it's been drawn in across the horizontal line on the diagram there. Okay, so if that were the case, then clearly in this instance, what would be the new level of demand at that point? Well, you can see our new level of demand at that price would be 90, this point here, okay, and the new level of domestic supply would be at 60. And so the quantity imported, the difference between what we can supply domestically and what is demanded domestically would be 30. Okay, so the quantity imported would be 30. Okay, now if the government decided that on the basis of that, that level of imports might mean that we would lose some jobs in that particular industry, then in this case, they might choose to impose a tariff of 20p per unit. So effectively, the original price was, let's assume it's 20 pence, was 20 pence per unit. It's now going to go up to 40 pence per unit because of the tariff that's been imposed. And here we can see the supply with tariff included. So what will happen there then? What will happen to domestic demand? How much will it fall by? So we can see that originally domestic demand at the original price was 90. Now in this instance, the demand is going to fall by 10 effectively. So so we can see that it was gone from 90, it's gone down to 80, and so domestic demand would fall by 10 because of the extra price. But domestic supply would rise by 10 effectively. So you can see originally domestic supply was at 60, it's now gone up to 70. And so as a result of that, we have got an increase in domestic supply. So to some degree, we are protecting domestic jobs, I suppose. Now, imports in this case would fall by 20. Now, the reason for that would be, as we can see in this instance, the imports were originally 60, and 90 was the original demand, and and the supply was 60. So in this instance, we've got a difference in this case from it's going to fall by a factor of 20, isn't it? Because effectively, in our new position, we are supplying 70 units and the demand is for 80 units. So if effectively that's going to fall, our imports will fall by 20 in total. Okay. Now, if we get into a scenario where the government imposed a tariff of 40 pence per unit, so added to the 20 pence world price and made it 40, that would essentially drive the price up to 60, and in that scenario, we wouldn't be importing any. Those imports would essentially be eliminated because supply and demand would be satisfied by the domestic market. Okay, so hopefully that starts to make a little bit more sense. And then obviously you can take a look at the next couple of questions, and then I think we'll stop. So in this instance, we're going to start to take a look at the next question, where we have some extension activities. Okay, so what would the government's revenue be if with the 20p per unit tariff? How much revenue would they generate as a result of that? So obviously that's going to depend on the amount demanded too. but in this instance that would be 200. Okay, so the 20 pence per unit basically has been added to the price, and in this case the amount of revenue generated would actually be 200. Okay, what would be the revenue for domestic producers then, before the tariff and then after the tariff? Well, in this instance, before the tariff, domestic producers would be producing and selling essentially 60 units at 20p, which gives them £1,200. Okay, and subsequent to that, after the tariff, basically they would be producing 70 units at 40p. So that would be a significant increase, as we can see, in terms of the amount of revenue that's been generated. Okay, what would be the change in revenue of domestic producers then? Well, we can see basically that would be an extra £1,600. So we take the one figure B, take A away from it, these two figures here, and that would give us an extra increase of 1,600 in revenue. Okay, and what about the revenue for importers then? Well, basically before the tariff, the revenue for importers was basically 30 times 20, so 30 units times 20 as the overall price. But after the tariff, well, basically there would be a reduction, because they would reduce the number of units to 10 times by 20, which would be the revenue that the importers would achieve. So that would only be 200. Okay, so what is the change in revenue for importers? Well, that would actually be £400, 400 units less in terms of revenue than the previous scenario. Okay, so you can see that from that relatively simple diagram, there are lots of things that we can pick up and develop and calculate as a result. Okie dokie. So let's take a look at the next point then, where we've got an annotated diagram, which is asking you in this case for various different questions in terms of what happens to the market by these changes from tariffs being employed. So this is the one. This is the labelled diagram at the bottom of page 35. And then the first question: what is the domestic equilibrium if the UK does not trade in at all with the rest of the world? Well, that's basically going to be the point at which a domestic supply and domestic demand intersect, and we could draw in a construction line to our equilibrium point and basically label that as P for price and Q for quantity. Okay, so that isn't drawn on the diagram as such, but clearly you could draw that in. Okay, that's the first question. If we then take a look at the second question: why is the world's supply curve assumed to be horizontal or perfectly elastic? So that's basically because it's very large compared to the UK. The world supply is very large to the UK, and the world market can supply a virtually endless supply of wheat at the prevailing world price. As a result of that, that's why in this instance we would have a horizontal or perfectly elastic market for wheat in terms of the world market. Let's take a look at the third question then: what is the domestic quantity supplied and quantity demanded if the UK imports wheat at the price, world price of PW? So you'll need to look at your original diagram and then draw in basically our domestic supply would be QS1 and our domestic demand would be QD1. Okay, so similar to what we've shown before, but shown in a slightly different format. Let's take a look at the fourth question then. What is the level of imports if the UK imports wheat at the price, world price of PW? So in that instance, the imports would be QS1 minus QD1. So okay, there is a significant difference there, isn't there? And that's the reason why the amount that we would import would be QS1 minus QD1. Looking at question 5 then, what is the domestic quantity supplied and quantity demanded if the UK imposes a tariff on imported wheat which raises the price to PW plus T? And in that instance, that's where we've essentially included the world tariff, or the tariff on the world price. And so in this instance, our domestic supply would move to QS2 and domestic demand would move to QD2. Okay, so obviously that would have a significant impact. We then take a look at question 6. What is the level of imports if the UK imposes a tariff on imported wheat which raises the price to PW plus T? So in this instance, that would basically mean that our imports would now be QS2 minus QD2. Okay, so that answers those 6 questions. Let's take a look also then at some of the welfare gains and losses from this tariff then. Okay, so obviously you'll need to refresh yourself in terms of welfare loss and gain. But in this instance, let's take a look at the next set of questions then on page 36. Okay, so first thing, define the term consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is the difference between the price that consumers are willing and able to pay for a good and the price that they actually have to pay. Okay, so that's the definition of a consumer surplus. Then so the second question asks you to draw a supply and demand diagram to illustrate total consumer surplus. So have a go at doing that. You might need to refresh your memory, look back at some of the notes that you will have done, probably with Mrs. M back in year 1. Draw in a simple supply and demand diagram to illustrate the total consumer surplus. And then we're going to define the producer surplus, the term producer surplus. Okay, so that definition is basically producer surplus is the difference between what producers are willing to and able to supply a good for and the price that they actually receive. And again, I'd like you to have a go at drawing that in a simple supply and demand diagram showing where there is producer surplus. Okay. Let's take a look at the next question then on page, still on page 36, question 5. Using the diagram on the previous page, which area represents the loss of consumer surplus after the tariff is imposed? So the loss of the consumer surplus due to the tariff is the area that's shown by the area 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay, so those would all be areas of loss of consumer surplus. Okie dokie. So the next question then, question 6. Which area represents the increase of producer surplus after the tariff is imposed? Okay, and in that case, the extra producer surplus due to the tariff would be area 1. If we then take a look at question number 7, which area represents the government's revenue from the tariff? That would basically be area 3. Okay, so that's the box that's included that shows the area of the government tariff that's been generated. And then if we take a look on page page 36, question 8, is society better off or worse off after the tariff? Well, it would be worse off because there's a deadweight loss of welfare from the areas 2 and 4. Okay, so again, you'll need to keep referring back to the diagram on page 35, and again, just make sure that you're completely familiar with that concept. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look then at some of the reasons for restrictions on free trade then. Now, you'll see in some instances we try to sort of mix this up a wee bit and make sure that you've got a variety of different options to consider. And in some cases, there is some content on on sheets all the way through from page 37 through to, I think, page 43, or maybe not page 43, certainly page 41, where there are various examples of in this case, reasons for restrictions on free trade. Okay, so I'd like you to complete those sheets, but we'll go through it step by step in the first instance and make sure that this all makes some sense to you. Okay, so if we're trying to evaluate tariffs and some of the principles of tariffs, then one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that the impact of any tariffs will depend on one thing, which is obviously the price elasticity of the demand and supply. If you've got relatively inelastic demand, then clearly that's not going to have a massive impact, is it? The level of tariff may not have a huge impact on the level of demand. So obviously the impact is going to depend on the price elasticity of demand. But it's also going to, as a result of that, it will also, and clearly it will also depend on the size of the tariff. Okay. If we're talking about this, and in some cases, you know, we've talked about the reasons why, we've touched on some of the reasons why tariffs are imposed. However, one of the issues is that it does sort of go against the law of comparative advantage, and one could argue that tariffs are basically stopping or reducing free trade, or the reasons why businesses might or economies might choose to trade with one another. Now, obviously, in some cases, we can understand in some cases why we might want to protect domestic industries, but it does make them less competitive in global markets. And if they are protected and they feel as though they've got, you know, a girder of steel around them, or a girdle of steel around them, and they're not going to be affected by global markets, they might become inefficient. They may not necessarily be as efficient as they should be because they know they're protected. And that the only other issue to bear in mind, particularly as far as tariffs is concerned, is if you start applying them, then there's a danger that others will retaliate. So other countries may choose to retaliate as a result. So that's something to bear in mind. So hopefully you understand the principles of how you demonstrate the application of a tariff, and that's quite an important diagram to be able to remember, but also evaluating the reasons how effective tariffs may be, but also some of the issues around using them. Okay, so let's take a look then at the next section, where what I'd like you to do is to work through a couple of examples for me. Okay, now one of the things that we've talked about here is and tried to show is some examples of how tariffs may be applied and the reasons for them. So there is a link here which talks about chicken prices that are set to soar in South Africa. It's a link that you can obviously go and click and go and take a look at, and it explains a little bit about the reasons why, in this case, South African authorities felt that it might be a good idea to increase import tariffs on chicken. So there's one link that you can go and take a look at. It's not quite as hideously graphic as it maybe first looks at if you look at that first picture, but there is a short video which actually explains some of the reasons why, in some cases, tariffs may be imposed. Another really good summary, which again just takes what we've said and puts it in a slightly different, not context, just a different way of explaining it, is Padge Holden's video. It's a 7-minute video on tariffs and protectionism. Tends to be driven quite clearly by the diagrammatic representation of tariffs and protectionism, but that's certainly one to take a look at if you just need a little bit of a slightly different approach, which actually explains it quite nicely. and Padge is a bit of a legend, so it's worth having a look at him. Okay, so let's then take a look at the pages 37 onwards. Okay, so where we're looking at the motivations for protectionism. Now, as you'll see, the way in which we've tried to structure this is to give you some content which helps you to understand the argument, the principle of the argument, but then I want you to try and do a little bit of research based on some of the examples that have been given to you, and also some of the content that's provided in these next few slides to try and fill in your evaluative statement in each section. So first and foremost, we've got on page 37, the first thing is protection of employment and income. So we've actually included some information there, but also then asked a bunch of questions in terms of how you might evaluate that statement. So how might businesses be affected if they depend on imports, as an example? Okay, so if we take a look at some of the motivations, now protectionist tendencies have grown because of slow growth and widening trade imbalances. Okay, now again, some of the reasons for that are included on that slide. It's quite a nice summary slide, that in terms of some of the reasons for it, some of the motivations, and other ways in which the different countries and economies might choose to go about protecting their own industries. So managing their currencies, devaluing their currencies, maybe, if you take China as the example, to try to make sure that people keep importing goods from their country because of the relative price difference by them managing their currency. Okay, so sorry about that interruption from my computer. So let's just carry on with this process then. So let's take a look at another thing that is going to be very helpful for you. Okay, so this is, again, relatively short video, about 8 minutes long, which actually explains some of the reasons why countries might choose to restrict trade. Okay, it's a link you can go and take a look at. And this should help you, along with some of the other things that are in the booklet, to complete the several different areas, sections in your booklet from 37 through to page 40. Okay, so have a look at this video. It's about 8.5 minutes long, and then you can use that to help you to answer some of the evaluative questions that are posed. And again, remember, what we're trying to do is if we're thinking about longer questions and trying to explain the fors and against of protectionism, we also need to evaluate those statements as well, evidence the evaluation, and also then come up with a judgment on whether we believe that protectionism is a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, so quite a lot of content for you to take a look at. I suspect this is probably going to take you a couple of lessons to do, but what I just want to do is go through and explain in a little bit more detail how you can then apply that. Okay, so if we take a look at the restrictions in reasons for restrictions in free trade, again, remember that we've got these gaps to complete in the booklet. I'd like you to take a look at that from page 38 through to 40. Okay, so in most instances, like I said, you've got the explanation of the reason for the restriction in free trade, but then I want you to try to consider what might be a good thing about that, what might be a bad thing about that. So try to evaluate, try to sum up whether you think that's a good reason or a bad reason. Or, you know, when I say a bad reason, I mean weighing up all of the reasons for restrictions in free trade. Do you still believe free trade is a good thing, or do you think it's a bad thing? And being able to put a balanced argument together effectively is what I'm saying, I suppose. So let's take a look at the first example. So we'll have a go at filling that in together. So the first thing we talk about is protecting employment, which obviously is a good thing. And on page 37, it mentions that governments restrict imports. It may preserve particular domestic industries and the jobs that they provide. The fall in the value of imports is also likely to cause an increase in aggregate demand and also a rise in national income as a result. Okay, now clearly, in this instance, we might then want to try and evaluate that as well and say, well, in this instance, okay, the evaluation to that would be that effectively free market economists would argue that trade barriers result in an overall loss of jobs in the economy. For a number of reasons. One being that other domestic industries may need to pay higher prices for resources, and so they become less competitive and less profitable. So we're trying to balance the fact that there's always pros and cons for these types of scenario. Okay, another example could be another evaluative statement as far as protecting employment is concerned is that if imports from LEDCs are restricted, then less economically developed countries, this would make it more difficult for those poorer economies to develop through earning income from export markets. So in terms of the overall pattern of world trade, then this slapping of trade barriers or protectionist measures is not necessarily going to encourage more international trade. If we then take a look at the next example, so the infant industry argument, and again, in some cases, you could quite justifiably argue that for a country that's trying to diversify in terms of its overall industry sectors, then that might be a reason why you might choose to protect that industry with tariffs. Okay. However, again, if we were going to evaluate that, there are always difficulties because the government isn't necessarily going to know which industries to protect, because it's going to probably have asymmetric information. It's not going to have perfect knowledge, and so as a result, it may choose to back the wrong horse. Firms are less likely to be globally competitive if they've got this protection barrier around them. So that's something to bear in mind too. And then obviously that creates less of an incentive to be efficient. However, you could argue that this has worked well for different parts of the world and different industries. So Airbus, Toyota, and Samsung have benefited from this principle. So let's just take a look at the evaluation as far as protecting sunset industries are concerned, and then we'll move on from there. So this is on page 38. Okay, so protecting sunset industries. So all this industries becoming less competitive. Again, the reasons for similar sort of arguments in terms of an evaluative argument to the issues around infant industries. So clearly, again, imperfect information by government. They may choose to back the wrong or protect the wrong sunset industry. There's clearly going to be less of an incentive for businesses to improve efficiency, particularly if they're being protected, and the government could be simply be forcing consumers to subsidise inefficient industries, which clearly isn't going to be good for anybody in terms of allocation of resources. Okay, diversifying the economy. Again, if we then take a look at page 38, you've got some text which explains the reasons why, trying to encourage economies to become have a wider range of economic factors that will help them to develop them, their countries and their economies. But the evaluative statement here would be, to some degree, it might actually help. So that could help to diversify. They could encourage new infant industries, but that's only really applicable to the poorer, less economically developed countries. To prevent dumping, that's the next. Again, there's a couple of paragraphs on what dumping is and how that can be avoided via the use of protectionist measures. But in terms of evaluation, that's clearly to some degree going to distort markets and any comparative advantage. And dumping is actually quite difficult to prove because again, government doesn't necessarily know what production costs are for foreign firms. So that they may be, again, it could be the asymmetric argument again. And the act of stopping dumping may only be justified if there is a significant harmful effects on domestic industries. Okay, one could argue that if that were the case, then that probably would be a reason for doing it. Let's take a look at the last couple of examples then. So to reduce competition from countries with cheap labour and poor labour and environmental laws, well, in this case, what we've done is taken away the scaffold a wee bit and asked you to explain what that is and also to evaluate. So let's take a look at how this might work then. So first things first, you could argue and we could explain that countries with high levels of cheap labour are often accused of providing unfair competition. So the high labour cost countries find it difficult to compete, and there's pressure from threatened industries to raise trade barriers. Well, clearly, one could argue that that's a very justifiable argument. But in this instance, also, you could apply a similar argument to the more lax environmental laws in some countries, which reduces the cost of organisations setting up in those countries. However, we're going to evaluate that. That's essentially going to just cause a misallocation of resources, because domestic consumers may be forced to buy from high-wage domestic industries rather than low-wage foreign industries, as an example. Okay, let's take a look at the next one then. We've just got 2 or 3 more to go, and then we'll stop. To correct imbalances on the current account of the balance of payments. Okay, so if we're going to explain that, trade barriers should reduce imports and therefore improve the balance of payments on the current account, the difference between exports and imports. However, may not be necessarily that effective if we as a country have a very high marginal propensity to import, for instance. Okay, if there are very few substitutes for our imported goods, then all that would do would essentially impose additional costs and in higher prices on consumers. Okay, and pretty much as we said previously, it's very much going to depend on the price or income elasticity of demand for those particular imports. Okay, so much as that might be a justifiable argument, there are some reasons in evaluative terms to not necessarily go down that route. If we're going to then look at the next one, then retaliate against restrictions imposed by other countries. Well, clearly, we've said before, if that we go through this tit-for-tat process of one country imposing import controls, that could then lead to retaliatory action, and that's then going to effectively mean that that's going to overall affect the volume of world trade, because if we got people arguing the toss about this, all that's going to do is reduce the volume of world trade. Examples, the classic one, and you will look at that in a bit more detail in the next section of the booklet, is the imposition of Mr. Trump whilst he was US president of aluminium and steel tariffs in 2018, which resulted in retaliation by not just China but also the EU and Russia. So clearly that can be a bit of a minefield, to say the least. If we're going to then evaluate that, then okay, retaliation basically doesn't benefit anyone. It could lead to a fall in the long-run aggregate supply, and that then means essentially that those retaliatory trade restrictions can be significant, create significant damage to world trade and to the economies that are affected by that. Okay, so preserving strategic industries like defence, food production and electricity generation. Well, again, one could argue that might make some sense. Okay, governments might restrict imports in order to be self-sufficient in markets that they believe to be strategically important. So, for instance, the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU would be a reason why you might choose to, or they might choose to restrict imports. But in terms of the evaluation, one of the things that is potentially going to cause is prices that consumers have to pay for goods could increase. And for food, as an example, maybe make it more difficult for low-income families in the EU to afford decent, healthy food, because they have this cap, essentially, that means that products have to be bought from EU countries. To raise tax revenue, that clearly you could argue that that might actually be a source of tax revenue. The tariff could be a source of tax revenue, probably more likely for developing countries as opposed to the more well-developed countries. Okay, so it's clearly going to depend on what goods you have tariffs applied to. If they're normal goods, then it could affect the ability of the poor families to meet their basic needs. And for developed economies, the vast bulk of tax revenue comes from taxation on income and spending, and tariff revenues, generally speaking, are a fairly small proportion of government revenue. However, for less economically developed countries, that could be quite an important source of revenue. Okay, so that's that one covered. Okay, the last one, and then I'm going to stop, is to look at preserving a way of life. Now in this instance, there is an argument that the cultural colour and variety of key parts of the world may be dependent on one or two industries, and if they decline, then the danger is the local population may be forced to leave, and some of the traditional ways of working might be lost as a result of that. So if we're going to try and evaluate that, and one could argue that if those industries are on their last legs, then it could well be that they're inefficient and prevent us from moving our resources to more efficient production or better use of those particular resources. Okay, so we're going to stop there, but you'll see that the next thing we're going to look at from page 40 in the next set of presentations is the US-China trade war, which just brings into sharp contrast the implications of tariffs and retaliation. Okay, so that's something we'll start next time round. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to catching up with you next time round. Remember, if there's anything you don't understand, obviously ask a question. You can do that via Teams or via email, and obviously when we have our online catch up too. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.